The sound of her stepfather's voice still echoed in Delilah Owen's ears as she stumbled down the dusty main street of Evanston, Wyoming, clutching her small carpet bag with trembling fingers. "Get out of my house, you disgraceful whore, and don't you ever come back." The door had slammed behind her with such finality that she'd felt it reverberate through her bones. And now here she was, 20 years old, 3 months pregnant, and utterly alone in the October chill of 1882. The sky above stretched endless and gray, promising an early winter, and she had nowhere to go. No money except the $2 hidden in her worn boot, and no one in this world who would claim her. She'd been walking for nearly an hour when her legs finally gave out, and she sank onto a wooden bench outside the general store, her vision swimming with exhaustion and despair. The baby's father had disappeared the moment she'd told him, vanishing like smoke on the wind, and when her stepfather had noticed her condition, he'd waited only until her mother left to visit her sister in Cheyenne before throwing Delilah out like yesterday's garbage. Her mother had always been too weak to stand up to him anyway, too beaten down by years of his cruelty to defend her own daughter. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down her cheeks as she pressed one hand to her still flat stomach. What kind of life could she give this child? How would they survive the winter? The boarding house wouldn't take her without money, and no respectable establishment would hire a pregnant woman with no husband and no references. "Miss, are you all right?" The voice was deep and gentle, touched with genuine concern, and when Delilah looked up through her tears, she saw a man standing before her, hat in his hands, his weathered face creased with worry. He was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of summer wheat. His clothes were dusty from the trail, his boots worn but well-maintained, and everything about him spoke of hard work and honest living. "I'm fine," she managed to choke out, though they both knew it was a lie. "Just resting." He glanced at the carpetbag beside her, then at the reddened imprint on her cheek where her stepfather had struck her that morning, and understanding dawned in those kind eyes. "You got somewhere to stay tonight?" She couldn't answer, couldn't force the words past the lump in her throat, and her silence told him everything he needed to know. He settled onto the bench beside her, careful to keep a respectful distance, and turned his hat over in his calloused hands. "Name's Harrison Xavier," he said quietly. "Got a ranch about 5 miles outside town. Nothing fancy, but it's warm and dry and there's plenty of food. I could use some help around the place, if you're looking for work." Delilah stared at him, searching his face for any sign of ulterior motives, any hint of the cruelty she'd seen so often in men's eyes. But there was only kindness there and something that looked like loneliness. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." "I know what it looks like when someone's got nowhere else to turn," Harrison said, his voice roughening with some old pain. "And I know what it's like to be alone in this world. My wife died 2 years ago in childbirth, along with our baby boy. House has been pretty empty since then." The grief in his words was raw and real, and Delilah felt something shift in her chest. Here was a man who understood loss, who knew what it meant to have everything torn away. "I'm pregnant," she blurted out, needing him to know the truth before he made any offers he might regret. "Not married. That's why my stepfather threw me out." Harrison's expression didn't change, didn't harden with judgment or disgust. He simply nodded slowly and said, "That baby's going to need a roof over its head and food in its belly, same as any child. Doesn't change my offer none." "I don't have money to pay you," Delilah whispered. "Didn't ask for money. Asked if you wanted work. You can help with the cooking and mending, tend the garden come spring, gather eggs from the chickens. That'll be payment enough." He stood and settled his hat back on his head, then offered her his hand. "Question is, are you willing to take a chance on a stranger, or would you rather freeze out here?" Delilah looked at his outstretched hand, calloused and honest and steady, and thought about her alternatives. She could stay in town and hope for charity that would never come, could try to find work that no one would give her, could slowly starve as winter closed in around her. Or she could trust this cowboy with the sad eyes and the gentle voice, this man who had loved and lost and somehow still had kindness to spare. She placed her hand in his and let him help her to her feet. The ride to Harrison's ranch took almost an hour on his sturdy bay horse, with Delilah sitting sideways in front of him, wrapped in his warm coat because she'd started shivering the moment they left town. He kept one arm around her to steady her, respectful and careful, and talked in that low, soothing voice about the ranch and the work that needed doing. "Got about 200 head of cattle, 20 horses, a dozen chickens, and one extremely stubborn goat named Sadie," he told her as they rode through the rolling Wyoming grassland. "House needs some fixing up, I'll admit. Haven't had much heart for it since Mary died. But it's solid enough, built it myself with my own 2 hands." "You built your whole house?" Delilah asked, turning her head to look at him. "Every board and nail," Harrison confirmed with a hint of pride. "Took me 2 years, working whenever I could spare the time. Mary and I were married just a month before I finished it. We had 6 good months together before she got pregnant." His voice caught slightly, and Delilah felt his arm tighten around her just a fraction. "Doctor said something went wrong with the birth, lost them both in the same hour." "I'm so sorry," Delilah whispered, and meant it with her whole heart. "Life's hard out here," Harrison said simply. "You learn to keep going or you don't survive. But I won't lie and say there haven't been nights when I wondered what the point was, rattling around in that empty house with nothing but memories for company." When the ranch came into view, Delilah caught her breath. It was beautiful in a stark, practical way, with a sturdy 2-story house painted white, a large red barn, several outbuildings, and fenced pastures stretching into the distance. Cattle dotted the landscape, and she could see horses moving in one of the corrals. Smoke rose from the chimney, which confused her until Harrison explained. "Got a ranch hand named Pete who lives in the bunkhouse. He keeps the fires going and helps with the heavy work. Good man, been with me since I started this place." Pete turned out to be a grizzled man in his 50s with a gray beard and a weathered face that broke into a smile when he saw them ride up. "About time you got back, boss. Was starting to think you'd gotten yourself lost in town." His eyes slid to Delilah with curiosity, but no judgment. "Who's this then?" "This is Miss Delilah Owen," Harrison said as he dismounted and then helped Delilah down with careful hands. "She's going to be helping around the house for a while." "Miss Owen, this is Pete Hawkins, best ranch hand in Wyoming and the only person I know who can make coffee strong enough to strip paint." "Pleased to meet you, miss," Pete said, touching the brim of his hat. "Don't you listen to him about my coffee. It's perfectly fine coffee." "It's terrible coffee," Harrison said with the first real smile Delilah had seen from him. "But he makes up for it by being able to shoe a horse faster than any man alive." The easy banter between them made something in Delilah's chest unclench slightly. There was warmth here, friendship, the kind of comfortable companionship she'd never known in her stepfather's cold house. Harrison led her inside, and she found herself in a large kitchen with a wood stove, a scarred oak table, and windows that let in the afternoon light. Everything was clean but sparse, functional rather than homey, and she could see the emptiness Harrison had talked about, the absence of a woman's touch. "Bedrooms upstairs," Harrison said, carrying her carpet bag as he led her up the narrow staircase. You can take the one at the end of the hall. It's got a good view of the sunrise, and Mary always said it was the warmest room in winter. He pushed open the door to reveal a simple room with a brass bed, a dresser, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window. I'll bring up some extra blankets. Gets cold at night this time of year. Delilah stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of it all. Why are you doing this? She asked again, needing to understand. You don't know anything about me. I could be a thief or a liar or worse. Harrison set down her bag and turned to face her, his expression serious. You could be, he agreed. But I don't think you are. I think you're a scared young woman who got dealt a bad hand and needs someone to give her a chance. And maybe I need someone here to make this place feel less empty. Maybe we can help each other. He paused, then added quietly, No strings attached, Miss Owen. You'll have your room, I'll have mine, and you're free to leave whenever you want. I'm not looking to take advantage. I'm just offering you a safe place to land. The sincerity in his voice broke something open inside her, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know what this means. Get yourself settled, Harrison said gently. Come down when you're ready and I'll fix us some supper. Pete usually eats in the bunkhouse, so it'll just be the two of us. After he left, Delilah sank onto the bed and let herself cry properly, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. But for the first time since she'd realized she was pregnant, they weren't tears of pure despair. Mixed in with the fear and grief was a tiny, fragile tendril of hope. The first weeks at the ranch passed in a blur of learning and adjusting. Delilah threw herself into the work, desperate to prove her worth, to show Harrison that his kindness hadn't been misplaced. She cooked meals that were far better than the bachelor fare he and Pete had been surviving on, mended clothes that had been torn for months, scrubbed the kitchen until it gleamed, and began the slow process of turning the house back into a home. Harrison was unfailingly kind and respectful, always careful to give her space, to avoid any appearance of impropriety. They ate breakfast and supper together, sitting at the kitchen table and talking about their days, their pasts, their dreams. She learned that he'd come to Wyoming from Missouri at 18, determined to build something of his own, and had worked himself nearly to death to make the ranch succeed. He learned that she'd been raised by her mother and stepfather after her real father died when she was 6, that she'd loved school but had to quit at 14 to help at home, that she'd once dreamed of being a teacher. You still could be, Harrison said one evening as they lingered over coffee. November had arrived with bitter cold, and frost painted the windows in delicate patterns. Once the baby's old enough, you could take the teaching exam. Evanston needs a good school teacher. No school's going to hire an unwed mother, Delilah said bitterly. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee mug. What if you weren't unwed? Delilah's heart stopped. What do you mean? I mean that people in town know you're pregnant and they're going to talk. They're going to make assumptions and judgments that'll make life hard for you and the baby. He met her eyes, his expression earnest and serious. But if you were married, if the baby had a father's name, things would be different, respectable. Are you asking me to marry you? Delilah whispered, hardly daring to believe it. I'm offering you my name and my protection, Harrison said carefully. I'm not asking for anything in return except your company and your help around the ranch. We could make it a business arrangement if you want, all legal and proper. Give your baby a good start in life. Give you a future that's not full of shame and struggle. Delilah stared at him, this good man who had already given her so much, who was now offering her even more. But what about love? What about everything a marriage is supposed to be? My heart's buried with Mary, Harrison said quietly. I don't expect to love like that again, But I've come to care about you these past weeks, Miss Owen. I like having you here, like the sound of your voice and your laugh, like the way you've brought life back into this house. That's more than a lot of marriages start with. What if I can't be what you need? Delilah asked, her voice trembling. What if you're exactly what I need? Harrison countered gently. Someone to share this life with, someone to build something with. Love comes in different forms, and maybe ours won't be the passionate, all-consuming kind. But it could be something good and real and lasting if we let it. Delilah thought about her baby, about the life growing inside her, about the future she could give that child as Harrison Xavier's wife versus the future that awaited them if she refused. But more than that, she thought about the man sitting across from her, the gentleness in his hands and the kindness in his eyes, the way he made her feel safe for the first time in longer than she could remember. Yes, she said softly. Yes, I'll marry you. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Evanston, with Pete and the minister's wife as witnesses. Delilah wore the only good dress she owned, and Harrison bought her a simple gold band that slipped onto her finger like it had always belonged there. When the minister pronounced them man and wife and invited Harrison to kiss his bride, Harrison brushed his lips against her forehead with such tenderness that Delilah felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered as they walked out of the church together, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm. "Don't thank me yet," Harrison said with a slight smile. "You haven't survived a Wyoming winter with me." True to his word, Harrison treated their marriage as a partnership rather than demanding the full rights of a husband. He moved some of his things into his office downstairs, so Delilah could have privacy in the upstairs bedroom, despite her protests that she should be the one to move. "You're carrying a baby," he said firmly. "You need the comfortable bed and the warm room. I'll be fine on the dabed in the office." As December arrived with fierce snowstorms and temperatures that dropped below zero, Delilah found herself growing more comfortable in her new life, more at ease with the man who was now legally her husband. Harrison was easy to live with, patient and understanding, with a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. He never pressured her for anything, never made her feel like she owed him, and treated her with a respect she'd never experienced from a man before. The baby began to show more prominently as Christmas approached, and Delilah caught Harrison looking at her expanding waistline sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. Grief, maybe, remembering his own wife's pregnancy, but something else too, something almost like wonder. "Does it hurt?" he asked one evening as they sat by the fire, Delilah knitting tiny booties while Harrison mended a bridle. "When the baby moves—" "No, it doesn't hurt," Delilah said, smiling at the question. "It feels strange, like butterflies or bubbles. Would you like to feel?" She'd barely finished the question before she regretted it, worried she'd overstepped, but Harrison set aside the bridle and moved to kneel beside her chair. "May I?" Delilah guided his hand to the side of her belly where the baby had been most active, and they waited in breathless silence until a small flutter rippled beneath his palm. Harrison's eyes went wide, his whole face transforming with amazement. "That's incredible," he breathed. "That's a whole person in there." "Your son or daughter," Delilah said softly, "because that's what the baby would be legally, what they'd agreed on. Harrison's child in the eyes of the law and the world." Harrison looked up at her, his hand still resting on her belly, and something passed between them, something warm and intimate that made Delilah's breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, truly kiss her, but then he pulled back and returned to his seat, though his eyes kept drifting to her throughout the rest of the evening. Christmas came and went quietly, with Delilah cooking a feast and Harrison presenting her with a beautiful cradle he'd been building in secret in the barn. She gave him a warm scarf she'd knitted from wool she'd unraveled from an old blanket, and the pleasure on his face made all the sore fingers worthwhile. "I have something else for you," Harrison said, after they'd finished their Christmas supper. He pulled a small box from his pocket and handed it to her. "I know we married for practical reasons, but you're my wife, and I wanted you to have something to mark the day." Inside the box was a delicate silver locket engraved with tiny flowers. Delilah gasped, her fingers trembling as she lifted it out. "Harrison, this is too much." "It's not enough," he said quietly. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. The house feels like a home again, and I don't dread the silence anymore. That's worth more than any locket." He took it from her and fastened it around her neck, his fingers gentle against her skin. "Merry Christmas, Delilah." "Merry Christmas, Harrison," she whispered, touching the locket and feeling its weight settle over her heart. January brought even worse weather, blizzards that lasted for days and left them snowed in with drifts up to the windows. Delilah's pregnancy advanced into her 6th month, and she found herself growing slower and more tired, her belly round and prominent now. Harrison took over more of the housework without being asked, insisting she rest, bringing her tea and making sure she ate enough. "You're going to spoil me," Delilah protested one afternoon as he brought her a blanket and tucked it around her legs while she sat in the rocking chair. "Good," Harrison said simply. "You deserve to be spoiled." The words were casual, but the way he looked at her was anything but, and Delilah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Over the past months, something had been shifting between them, growing and changing like the baby in her womb. What had started as gratitude and mutual need had deepened into genuine friendship. And lately, she'd begun to feel something more, something that made her heart race when Harrison smiled at her, that made her long for his company when he was out working in the bitter cold. She was falling in love with her husband, she realized with a start. Falling in love with his kindness and his strength, with the way he hummed tunelessly while he worked, and the way he always made sure she was warm and comfortable. Falling in love with a man who had married her out of compassion, who had told her his heart was buried with his first wife. The realization terrified her. February brought a brief thaw, and Harrison took advantage of the break in the weather to ride into town for supplies. He'd been gone for hours, longer than expected, and Delilah found herself pacing the kitchen anxiously, watching out the window for any sign of his return. When she finally saw him riding up the path, relief flooded through her so intensely that she had to grip the counter for support. That's when she knew for certain. She loved him with a depth and intensity that scared her, loved him in a way that made his absence painful and his presence essential, and she had no idea if he would ever feel the same way. Harrison came in stamping snow from his boots, his arms full of packages. "Sorry I'm late," he said, setting everything on the table. "Ran into Doc Matthews in town, and he wanted to talk about the baby. I told him you were doing well, but he said he'd like to come out and check on you next week, make sure everything's progressing normally." "That's kind of him," Delilah said, still rattled by her realization. "Harrison, I need to tell you something." He turned to her, concern immediately creasing his features. "What's wrong? Are you feeling all right? Is it the baby?" "No, it's not that. We're both fine." Delilah took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I just need you to know that I'm grateful for everything you've done for me. You saved my life and my baby's life, and I'll never forget that. But somewhere along the way, my feelings changed, grew into something more than gratitude." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I've fallen in love with you, Harrison. I don't expect you to feel the same way. I know you still love Mary, and I would never ask you to stop. But I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep it hidden when my heart feels like it's going to burst every time you walk into a room." The silence that followed was excruciating. Harrison stared at her, his expression unreadable, and Delilah felt her heart sink. She'd ruined everything, broken the careful balance of their arrangement with her foolish feelings. But then Harrison crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and cupped her face in his hands. "Delilah," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I will always love Mary. She was my first love, and losing her nearly destroyed me. But loving her doesn't mean I can't love again, doesn't mean my heart can't make room for someone else." His thumbs brushed away tears she hadn't realized were falling. "I've been fighting my feelings for you for weeks now, telling myself it was too soon, that it wasn't fair to you or to Mary's memory. But the truth is, I've fallen in love with you too. With your courage and your kindness, with your laugh and your smile, with the way you've brought joy back into my life. I love you, Delilah Xavier, and I want this marriage to be real in every way if you'll have me." "Yes," Delilah sobbed, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I'll have you. I love you so much." Harrison kissed her then, truly kissed her for the first time, and it was everything Delilah had dreamed of and more. Tender and passionate, full of promise and hope, the kind of kiss that sealed a bond that could weather any storm. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I'm going to be a father to that baby," he said quietly. "Not just in name, but in truth. I'll love that child like my own blood, raise them and protect them and teach them everything I know. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret trusting me that day in town." "I could never regret it," Delilah whispered. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me." That night, Harrison moved his things back upstairs, and Delilah fell asleep in her husband's arms, finally feeling like she'd found her home. The baby came on a warm April morning, arriving 2 weeks earlier than expected. Doc Matthews made it to the ranch in time to oversee the delivery, with Harrison holding Delilah's hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement and love, refusing to leave even when the doctor suggested he might be more comfortable waiting downstairs. "I'm not going anywhere," Harrison said firmly, kissing Delilah's sweat-dampened forehead. "We're in this together." The birth was long and difficult, and there were moments when Delilah feared she wouldn't survive, when she understood viscerally what Harrison had lost with Mary. But Doc Matthews was skilled and experienced, and finally, after 14 hours of labor, a baby's cry filled the room. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, placing the squalling infant on Delilah's chest. "A healthy baby boy." Delilah looked down at her son, at his red face and tiny fists, and felt a love so overwhelming it was almost painful. But when she looked up at Harrison, saw the tears streaming down his face as he gazed at the baby, she knew he felt it too. "He's perfect," Harrison whispered, touching one tiny hand with a gentle finger. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Delilah asked. Harrison was quiet for a moment, then said, "What about Daniel? It was my grandfather's name, and he was the best man I ever knew." "Daniel Xavier," Delilah said, testing the name. "I love it." The weeks after Daniel's birth were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Harrison was a devoted father, getting up for nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with the baby when he was fussy. Delilah watched her husband with their son, and fell even more deeply in love, marveling at how this hard-working cowboy could be so gentle and patient with such a tiny creature. "You're a natural at this," she told him one evening as she watched him rock Daniel to sleep, singing a tuneless lullaby in his deep voice. "I always wanted to be a father," Harrison admitted. "Losing my son before I ever got to hold him was one of the hardest things I've ever endured. Having Daniel here, getting to do all the things I dreamed of, it's healing something in me I didn't know was still broken." "He's lucky to have you as his father," Delilah said softly. "I'm the lucky one," Harrison corrected. "Lucky that you walked into my life when you did, that I was brave enough to offer you my hand, that you were brave enough to take it. Everything good in my life now exists because of you." As spring bloomed into summer, life on the ranch found a happy rhythm. Pete proved to be excellent with babies, spending his evenings whittling toys for Daniel and making the child laugh with silly faces. The cattle were thriving, the crops were growing well, and Harrison began talking about expanding the ranch, adding another pasture and maybe some sheep. "We're going to need a bigger operation if we want to send Daniel to a good school someday," he explained to Delilah as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. Daniel was asleep in the cradle beside them, one tiny fist curled under his chin. "He's only 4 months old," Delilah laughed. "You're already worried about school." "I want him to have every opportunity," Harrison said seriously. "Want him to go to college if he wants to become whatever he dreams of being. That takes money and planning." "He could always be a rancher like his father," Delilah suggested, leaning her head on Harrison's shoulder. "He could," Harrison agreed. "And if that's what makes him happy, I'll teach him everything I know. But he should have choices, should get to decide his own path." Delilah loved this about her husband, his fierce determination to give Daniel a better life than either of them had known. "You're going to be the kind of father every child deserves," she said, tilting her face up to kiss his jaw. Harrison caught her mouth with his, the kiss deepening until they were both breathless. "Speaking of children," he murmured against her lips, "Doc Matthews said you were healed enough, if you wanted to try for another baby, that is. No pressure, of course, but I've been thinking about how nice it would be for Daniel to have a brother or sister." "I've been thinking about that too," Delilah admitted. "I'd love to give him siblings, to fill this house with children and noise and chaos." "Then let's make that happen," Harrison said with a grin and swept her up into his arms, carrying her into the house while she laughed and protested that he should be more careful, that he'd hurt his back. "My back is fine," Harrison assured her, kicking the bedroom door closed behind them. "And I plan to spend the rest of the night proving it to you." By the time autumn arrived again, a year after that fateful day when Delilah had found herself alone and desperate on a bench in Evanston, she was pregnant again. This time, though, everything was different. She was married to a man who loved her, mother to a healthy baby boy, mistress of a thriving ranch, and surrounded by people who cared for her. "Hard to believe it's only been a year," she said to Harrison one October evening as they stood at the bedroom window, watching the first snow of the season begin to fall. Daniel was asleep in his cradle, and Delilah's hand rested on her still flat stomach where their second child was growing. "Best year of my life," Harrison said, wrapping his arms around her from behind and resting his chin on top of her head. "Well, second best. The year I met Mary was pretty good too." "It doesn't hurt to hear you talk about her anymore," Delilah said. "I'm glad you loved her, glad you have those memories. She helped make you the man you are." "She'd have liked you," Harrison said quietly. "Would have appreciated how you brought me back to life, how you made me remember that there's joy to be found even after terrible loss." They stood there together, husband and wife, watching the snow fall and thinking about the future that stretched before them, bright and full of promise. The second baby, a girl they named Dorothy after Delilah's mother, arrived the following June during a summer thunderstorm. The birth was easier this time, faster, and when Harrison held his daughter for the first time, Delilah saw the same wonder and love on his face that he'd shown with Daniel. "She looks like you," he said, marveling at the baby's delicate features. "Same nose, same chin. She's going to be beautiful." "She's going to be spoiled rotten by her father," Delilah predicted with a laugh. Absolutely, Harrison agreed without shame. What's the point of having a daughter if you can't spoil her? With 2 babies under 2, life became wonderfully chaotic. The house was never quiet, never still, filled with crying and laughter and the constant demands of small children. Harrison hired a young woman from town named Sarah to help with the housework, so Delilah wouldn't be overwhelmed. And Pete proved to be an enthusiastic surrogate grandfather, always ready to hold a baby or play with a toddler. "This is what I always wanted," Harrison told Delilah one night after they'd finally gotten both children to sleep. They were collapsed on their bed, exhausted but happy. "A house full of life and love, a family to come home to. You gave me that, Delilah. You gave me everything." "We gave each other everything," Delilah corrected, intertwining her fingers with his. "I was lost and broken when you found me and you put me back together, made me believe in love and hope and second chances. Third chances in my case," Harrison said with a slight smile, "but who's counting?" Over the next several years, their family continued to grow. A 3rd child arrived, another boy they named Henry, followed 2 years later by twin girls, Margaret and Lily. The house that had once echoed with emptiness and grief now rang with children's voices, and Harrison expanded it twice to accommodate their growing brood. The ranch prospered under Harrison's careful management and Delilah's shrewd business sense. She took over the bookkeeping and correspondence, proving to have a natural talent for numbers and negotiation. Together, they built something remarkable, a successful operation that provided well for their family and employed several local men. Pete grew older and eventually retired from active ranch work, but he refused to leave, spending his days teaching the children to whittle and fish and care for animals. He became Uncle Pete to all of them, as much a part of the family as anyone bound by blood. When Daniel turned 8, Harrison sat him down for a serious conversation. Delilah watched from the kitchen doorway, her heart in her throat, as her husband explained to their eldest son that he wasn't his biological father, that he'd married Delilah when she was already pregnant, that he'd chosen to be Daniel's father rather than being born to it. "Does that change how you feel about me?" Daniel asked, his young face serious. "Not one bit," Harrison said firmly. "You're my son in every way that matters. I was there when you were born, held you in my arms before anyone else, walked the floor with you every night when you had colic. I've taught you to ride and rope, watched you grow from a baby into this amazing boy. Being your father is one of the greatest honors of my life, and nothing could ever change that." "Good," Daniel said, relief evident in his voice. "Because you're my pa and I don't want anyone else." Harrison pulled the boy into a tight hug, and Delilah saw tears on her husband's cheeks. Later that night, as they lay in bed, Harrison told her, "I was so afraid he'd feel differently about me, that it would change things between us." "You're the only father he's ever known," Delilah reminded him. "The only one he'll ever need. Blood doesn't make a family, Harrison. Love does. And that boy has never doubted for a second how much you love him." "I do love him," Harrison said fiercely. "Love all of them more than my own life. Sometimes I look around at what we've built, at our children and our home and our life together, and I can hardly believe it's real. That scared, broken man sitting alone in an empty house is someone I barely remember. And that terrified girl sitting on a bench with nowhere to go feels like another lifetime," Delilah agreed. "We've come so far, you and I, built something beautiful out of desperation and grief and unexpected kindness." "Best decision I ever made, offering you my hand that day," Harrison said, pulling her close. "Best decision I ever made taking it," Delilah replied. The years continued to unfold in a pattern of work and joy, challenges, and triumphs. There were hard times, droughts that threatened the cattle and illnesses that swept through the children. But they weathered every storm together, their love deepening with each passing season. Harrison never forgot to tell Delilah he loved her, never took for granted the miracle of their life together. And Delilah made sure her husband knew every day how grateful she was, how much she cherished the home and family they'd built. When Daniel turned 18 and announced his intention to stay on the ranch rather than go to college, Harrison was secretly pleased, though he made sure his son knew he supported whatever choice he made. Dorothy proved to have her mother's head for business and went to Cheyenne to study accounting, planning to return and help run the ranch's expanding operations. Henry developed a love for horses and began breeding them, adding a new dimension to the ranch's income. The twins, inseparable as always, dreamed of opening a dress shop in town someday. "We did something right," Harrison said to Delilah one evening as they sat on the porch, watching their adult and nearly adult children going about their evening chores. He was 53 now, his dark hair liberally threaded with silver, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. But his eyes, when they looked at his wife, were as warm and loving as they'd been that first day in town. "We did everything right," Delilah corrected, reaching over to take his hand. She was 41, still beautiful despite the lines around her eyes and the few strands of gray in her dark hair. "We built a family and a home and a life worth living. We turned tragedy into triumph. We loved each other through everything." "Still do," Harrison said, bringing her hand to his lips. "Love you more now than I did 20 years ago, if that's even possible." "It's possible," Delilah assured him, "because I feel the same way. Every year with you has been better than the last. You're still the cowboy who gave me his name and his home when I had nothing. Still the man who saved my life and stole my heart." "You saved me right back," Harrison reminded her. "Gave me reason to keep going, filled my empty house and my empty heart, made me believe in second chances and new beginnings." As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple and pink, Harrison and Delilah sat together in the comfortable silence of a love that had endured 2 decades of life's joys and sorrows. Around them, their children laughed and worked and lived, the next generation of Xaviers carrying on the legacy their parents had built from nothing but desperation and kindness and hope. Daniel brought his new bride to meet them the following spring, a sweet girl from town named Emma, who looked at their eldest son with the same love and devotion Harrison and Delilah had always shared. The wedding was held at the ranch in June, with what seemed like half of Evanston in attendance, and Harrison cried unashamedly as he watched his son marry the woman he loved. "Our baby's all grown up," Delilah whispered, dabbing at her own tears. "First of many weddings we'll be hosting, I imagine," Harrison replied, watching Dorothy dance with a young lawyer from Cheyenne who'd been courting her for months. "This ranch is going to be full of grandchildren before we know it." He was right. Daniel and Emma's first child, a boy they named Harrison after his grandfather, arrived 10 months later, and Delilah watched her husband hold his grandson with the same tenderness he'd shown their own children. Dorothy married her lawyer the following year, and Henry courted and wed the daughter of a neighboring rancher, bringing her to live at the Xavier Ranch and help with the horse breeding operation. The house expanded again, with cottages built for the married children who wanted to stay on the ranch, and the property itself grew to encompass thousands of acres. What had started as one man's modest operation had become a family empire, built on hard work and love, and the kind of fierce determination that characterized the best of the American West. Through it all, through weddings and births, through droughts and harsh winters, through the slow passage of time that turned children into adults and adults into grandparents, Harrison and Delilah remained the steady heart of the Xavier family. Their love story became legend in Evanston, told and retold as an example of how kindness and compassion could change lives, how love could bloom in the most unexpected circumstances, how second chances could lead to greatest joys. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Delilah with a trip to Denver, their first real vacation in all their years of marriage. They stayed in a fancy hotel, ate in elegant restaurants, and walked the city streets hand in hand like newlyweds. On their last night, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room watching the city lights sparkle below, Harrison pulled a small box from his pocket. "What's this?" Delilah asked, taking the box with trembling fingers. "Open it and see." Inside was a ring, not her simple gold wedding band but an elegant piece with 3 diamonds set in a delicate band. "Harrison, it's beautiful, but you already gave me a ring." "That ring was for a marriage of convenience," Harrison said softly. "This one is for the marriage we built together, for 25 years of love and partnership and choosing each other every single day, for the life we created from nothing but hope and faith and determination." Delilah slipped the ring onto her finger beside her wedding band, then threw her arms around her husband's neck. "I love you so much, so very, very much. You're still my cowboy, still my hero, still the man who saved me when I had nowhere else to turn." "And you're still my miracle," Harrison replied, holding her tight. "The woman who brought me back to life, who gave me a family and a future and reasons to smile every single day. Marrying you was the best thing I ever did, Delilah Xavier." They renewed their vows in Denver the next morning, just the two of them and a minister, speaking promises they'd already kept for a quarter century, but wanted to affirm again. To love and to cherish, in sickness and health for richer or poorer, until death parted them. Words that had been mostly formality the first time, spoken out of practicality and hope, but now carried the weight of decades of lived experience. When they returned to the ranch, they found their children had organized a surprise party, with the entire extended family, and half the town gathered to celebrate. There was food and music and dancing, laughter and joy, and Harrison stood with his arm around his wife, surveying the crowd of people who existed because he'd offered a hand to a desperate woman on a cold October day so many years ago. "Worth it," he murmured to Delilah. "Every moment, every struggle, every hard day and sleepless night, all worth it for this." "For us," Delilah agreed, leaning into his embrace. "Always for us." The years rolled on, bringing more grandchildren, then great-grandchildren, filling the ranch with new generations of Xaviers. Harrison and Delilah grew old together, their bodies slowing even as their love remained constant and strong. They sat on the porch in matching rocking chairs, watching their legacy unfold before them, marveling at how far they'd come from that desperate beginning. When Harrison fell ill in his 72nd year, Delilah nursed him with the same devotion he'd always shown her, sitting by his bedside and holding his hand through the long nights. Their children gathered around, bringing the grandchildren and great-grandchildren to say goodbye, and Harrison looked at each face with love and pride. "I'm ready," he told Delilah on a quiet morning in late September, when the aspens were turning gold and the air carried the first hint of winter. "I've had a good life, a full life, more than I ever dreamed possible." "Don't you dare leave me yet," Delilah said fiercely, though tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. "We have more years left, more grandchildren to meet, more sunsets to watch together." "We've had 43 years together," Harrison reminded her gently. 43 years of love and joy and building something that will last long after we're gone. That's more than most people get in 2 lifetimes. And when my time comes, I'll go knowing I loved you with everything I had, that I kept every promise I made to you that day we married. You kept them all, Delilah whispered. You gave me your name and your home and your heart. You loved my child as your own, built a family and a legacy that will endure for generations. You were everything I needed and more than I deserved. No, Harrison said firmly, squeezing her hand with what strength he had left. You were exactly what I deserved. My reward for having the courage to offer kindness when it mattered most. You were my second chance at happiness, and I thank God every day that I was brave enough to take it. But Harrison Xavier was a fighter, and he surprised everyone by rallying, clinging to life with the same stubborn determination that had built the ranch from nothing. He made it through the winter and into spring, lived to see another grandson born, watched as Daniel's son Harrison Jr. took over as ranch foreman, ensuring the family business would continue strong into the next generation. On a warm May morning, with wildflowers blooming across the Wyoming plains and the ranch bustling with life and activity, Harrison Xavier died peacefully in his sleep, with his beloved wife lying beside him and their entire family gathered in the house below. He was 72 years old, had lived a life full of love and purpose, and left behind a legacy that would echo through the generations. Delilah grieved deeply, as was expected for a woman who'd lost the love of her life. But she took comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch that still thrived, in the knowledge that Harrison had died happy and fulfilled. She lived another 11 years, seeing great-great-grandchildren born, watching the Xavier Ranch continue to grow and prosper, keeping alive the story of how it all began with a desperate woman and a kind cowboy on a cold October day. When Delilah Owen Xavier died at 81, surrounded by family in the home Harrison had built with his own hands, she went peacefully and without fear, knowing she'd lived a life beyond anything she'd imagined possible. She'd been loved deeply and had loved in return, had raised children and built a legacy, had turned tragedy into triumph through courage and faith and the kindness of one good man. They buried her beside Harrison on a hill overlooking the ranch with a headstone that read, "Together they built a family, a home, and a love that death cannot diminish, reunited at last." And the Xavier Ranch continued on, passed down through the generations, each one carrying forward the values Harrison and Delilah had instilled: kindness in the face of cruelty, compassion for those in need, the courage to offer second chances, and above all, the transformative power of love that asks nothing in return but gives everything.